East Dulwich pubs, 1860 to 1960. I'm sure you all know on your left you have the East Dulwich Tavern, and the centre the Palmerston. On the right-hand side, what is now the Great Exhibition, but of course was the Crystal Palace Tavern. And I will generally describe the pubs in the names they used to have, not in their new names. First slide, just to show you the difference between the order East Dulwich in 1870 on our left, where we can just, those of you with a telescopic eyesight can just see on the corner here, the Palmerston. There's the floor cloth factory, which we'll meet later when we're talking about the Crystal Palace Tavern. Here's the Freehan Manor House. So most of this is Freehan Manor Farm, and only the roads, a few roads are starting to come in. And here we are 25 years later, where the whole place has been almost completely built over. And that's why most of the pubs were built between 1860 and 1880. And here is a list of them. There's 22 of them, and the ones in red, and you can see from the brackets at the end of the line, they're the ones that are closed. So of the 22 pubs that were built between 1730 and 1969, 17 are still operating. And here is the, so we're starting with the Plough in the 1730s. The White Horse in Peckham Rye, you might say that's not East Dulwich, but it is west of Peckham Rye. So everything west of Peckham Rye, in my view, is in East Dulwich. I'm sure Peckham Society might not agree, but so we've got all these here. And the last one, of course, is the Clock House in at the end of Barry Road, which dates only from 1969. Before that, it was an off license. So I'll just show you the 5 pubs or buildings that 5 pubs that are closed. This is the Ivanhoe Hotel in Ivanhoe Road, the Heber Arms, the Moore Park Hotel at the southeastern end of the Camberwell Cemetery, the Oglander, done up quite well. It still looks the part, and the only one that's actually been knocked down and rebuilt, partly because it was destroyed in World War II, is of course the King's Arms on the corner of Peckham Rye and Dulwich Road. So those are the 5 pubs that no longer with us as trading, but they are still with us. So we're going to start with the oldest pub. Now, just to so that you will see at the bottom line, this line will appear on every sheet. It tells you what the pub is, what the name's changed to, if it did, and the first side will give you the names of the breweries, and the name in brackets is the current brewer, as far as I can tell. You'll also see in this green colour newspaper articles and various notes, and a lighter colour will show you advertisements, original advertisements from the time. But when we talk about the Plough, which the building here you see dates from 1858, although there has been a pub on that site at least since 1730, but we'll come on to in a minute. But the thing, of course, to remember about the Plough is the famous change of name in the 90s, when Bass Taverns changed to the Goose and Granite. There was a huge outcry locally. They tried to compromise with the Goose and Granite at the Plough, but of course it is now the Plough, and they gave up, which is good in a way. It doesn't, I mean, this is one taken a couple of years ago. This is taken in the 30s. And this is what it used to be like when it was built in 1734. And you've got this sign here. There's a report, newspaper report on this, that in March 1810, Thomas Mount Jones dined here, ate 6 pounds of bacon and drank 19 pints of beer. Now, each of these starting slides, I'll show you a list of the proprietors, landlords, licensees, and managers. It's very difficult to work out. It's generally easiest to find the managers, but proprietors, landlords, and licensees is more difficult because a lot of pubs were owned by the proprietors, and they weren't the licensees. But in this case, here we've got the premises built 1730. first leased to Josh Wyndham, then Richard Reynolds. We know that because we have a fire license, a Sun Assurance fire license to Richard Reynolds, dated 1791. You would think, given what the pub looked like, it probably wasn't a great insurance. It was a huge insurance risk, because I mean the thing could have burnt down at any minute. But a very sort of rural type pub. And then his wife, and then William Coombs, and the premises, as I say, rebuilt 1858. And we have here, I'm not going to ask you to read everything, but these are quite interesting. That's the earliest reference we have found to the pub, when it was called the Plough and Harrow. Here, the Plough and Harrow in Lordship Lane. We're making the assumption that the Plough and Harrow is the plough. There's certainly nothing else we can find to prove it was or it wasn't. But this is the first one when somebody working for Woolmere Cox at the Green Man, further up, Cox's Walk, was murdered on Sydenham Common. And here we have a sort of public hearing, a warning to local magistrates, local watchkeepers, about some crooks out and about stealing things from pubs in the deep suburbs. And of course, East Dulwich was more or less in the country then. And you got, here we are, the Plough, and the lovely, everything is, where's S's is F. They found them, but they blacked and discolored. They armed themselves with pistols and cutlasses and entered several public houses around London late in the evening and stole plate and various other bits and pieces. But rather quaintly put. The Augustus Man here is the landlord licensee from 1896 to 1911. At the top end, you can see his career. And this was quite a common thing, how people came into, there were people who were born in the licensed trade and their families were in the licensed trade, but there are others who came into it. You can see here, Augustus Man, he's a butcher, then a builder, then a publican, and a very successful publican. And this is when he took over the pub in 1896, and this is where he dogged Britain, the Camberwell Vestry had a habit, as we'll find later as well, of when a pub changed hands, they would up the rates on the basis that the selling price of the pub had risen, so the rate should rise. And Man didn't agree with this and took the Overseas and Assessments Committee to court, almost to court, because appeals said, and it's all here. And he managed to get a substantial reduction on his rates. And as the newspaper report says that, and it's given that the way was phrased, but it's almost today that when he started the campaign, everybody said, you must be wasting your time. Certain defeat was predicted by his friends. And it's the story of here fighting against a local authority who can draw unlimited cash from the local exchequer. How much courage, in fact, downright dogged determination. It's dogged that does it. So he was obviously quite a character. And this is a newspaper picture of him. And here is the pub, circa 1900, with horse-drawn buses outside. It's Worthington-on-Drott. It's the City of London Brewery at that point. There's his name. It was quite common for the licensee or the landlord to have his name in very large letters on the front of the pub. It's almost as fun here, though, on the second one, the library and park refreshment and tea rooms, sweets, ices. Advertising on buildings wasn't a problem in Victorian times. There was certainly no planning department to come and say, take it down. But anyway, here's the buses parked outside. And here's a slightly later shot. Every shot that a tram appears on in East Dulwich is after 1906, because that's when the trams arrived. And you can see we're just on the cusp. The trams have started running. And in fact, this is probably a little bit later, 1908, because you've got double-decker trams. Before that, they were single-decker. And here are the horse buses, soon to be out of business and put away. Here are some of the buses, the 12 buses that used to run to the East Dulwich Tavern, the East Dulwich to the plough. You've got the old ones, all number 12s. And of course, ones we've forgotten, the bendy bus. And here is a more modern one. And I've asked the question here, why does the bus go through Peckham than Camberwell? Well, you would have thought it would be more logical to go the other way. But in fact, they've always gone down Barry Road because it's not possible for a horse-drawn bus. It wasn't possible for a horse-drawn bus to come further south than the Magdala Tavern. We'll see the Magdala shortly, because the slope up from the Magdala Tavern, as you rise up, go south on Lordship Lane, you rise up, the road rises, and it was called Dulwich Hill, and the horse buses couldn't get up it. And in fact, they struggled in Barry Road. Even though you look at Barry Road, you drive up it now, you think it's probably pretty flat. Looking at these postcards, it's a gentle slope, but it's a continuous slope. And that's why Thomas Tilling had to build the stables in Milo Road to rest the horses, because by the time the horses got up here, they were absolutely knackered. But they all went via Peckham. And here is the final 1951, the 2 trams running down here. And of course, the forecourt of the pub, which is now where you sit, was used as a bus park. You know, people randomly crossing the road. Look at the traffic. It's quite lots of bicycles. But let's move down. We're moving down Lordship Lane. Let's go to the Magdala. Now the Lordship. This was taken a few years ago. I think it's now slightly darker grey, the colour, but the mural is still there. And that's been Truman's. The current owner is called Damp Investments Limited. But it's been a Truman's breweries for quite a while, although not forever. Built quite early, 1867. In fact, by David Prentice. Clayton was going to be the original licensee, but he never was. And it was a beer house for quite a while. Both David and his wife Anne ran it as a beer house. He was a builder, but it was used as beer. Because in those days, a beer house didn't need a license, whereas a pub which sold spirits did. It's named after the Battle of Magdala, when the British forces went down the Nile and sorted out some Ethiopian disagreements with the Ethiopians. Otherwise, the pubs are generally more locally named, either with the roads of the area or by their builders. But this is the first landlord. This is called Ludwig Siegel. He was, in fact, a German. He'd come over from Germany. He was a watchmaker. He'd come over from Bavaria, and he'd set up a watchmaking business in Greenwich. There's quite a lot about him and the family online, but no reason why he suddenly became publican. But anyway, he turns up in Dulwich in the Magdala, and this is his family. These are his sisters, Philippine and Julie, who are pictured singing at the Albert Hall. But more intriguing, and this is what research does for you when you get into it. This is the Lady in White, who was in fact his granddaughter. And the Lady in White is a statue in Durban in South Africa. And she used to sing to the troops who were leaving, going out of Durban Harbour. She used to sing with her megaphone. She used to stand on the cliffs near the ships going out to sea and sing to them as a sort of bon voyage. But that was his granddaughter. Here's a couple of adverts. Here's Ludwig Siegel just when he's taken over in 1874. It's great news. I've got a new full victualler's license, and I'll be able to give them spirituous liquors of the finest brands. And of course, every pub would have had stables and accommodation for travellers. Not long afterwards, and I have a feeling that Siegel was probably just a manager, and in fact, Dowling was the proprietor. And here he is from the castle in Holborn, but he's taken over the tavern, takes over the pub, makes several improvements. And again, all liquors are the very best quality. I mean, not that you would advertise saying all liquors are not of the very best quality, but they were very keen in Victorian times to say how good their stuff was. But interestingly here, the pub is Courage. He uses Courage. It's not Truman's, so it is Truman's. It was Truman's for most of its life, but it was Courage when it started. And here is my point about the bus. Although this postcard shows the pub in about 1900, because Walter Collison is the name on the thing, on the fascia there, The buses could not get further up Lordship Lane beyond this point. So when the bus service started in East Dulwich, it ran down Lordship Lane and then along past Goose Green to Peckham. And this is the terminus, as it were. And here is the newspaper article of the time saying it's great to have a bus service, really, really thrilled, but it would be really good if it timed with the train so that you could get on you could take the bus and get the train without having to wait or be late or run at breakneck speed or wait 10 minutes. And the same with the evenings. Perhaps, you know, a bit of logic. Let's do it properly. And I mean, Thomas Tilling had a reputation for running buses 2 times. So it's slightly strange when he started that he didn't. But anyway, may ask Mr. Tilling to sort it out, but presumably he did. Here's picture 1900, which again, Walter Collison. By this time it's Truman's. And this is a picture in 1910 with Charles Durden as the landlord here and here. We'll meet Walter Collison later down the road because he moved down to another pub. But this is quite an intriguing one. This is again online. Harry Weeks, who was the land tenant for more than 25 years in the 20s. It's quite interesting to see their careers. You know, he started off as a potman, became a barman. Then he became a manager. Then he progressed to better pubs, West Hume, and then he ended up at the Magdala Tavern. And as this little quote says, he was on the annual renew day at the Newington bench. He was one of the 4 who'd completed 50 years as a licensee under their control. We've also found out, quite interestingly, he was quite an avid motorcyclist. We found reference to him being up in court in other part of the country for speeding. And his other claim to fame, or perhaps not claim to fame, was one of his daughters married the brother of Lord Haw, who lived in Dulwich, because the Lord Haw, whose parents ran a greengrocer's shop not very far from here. And this is what the Magdala looked like in 1980, getting a little bit sad. And in fact, it had looked sad for quite a while, and it had 1 or 2 other names before it became the Lordship. But it's good to see it operating and still there. We're going further down Lordship Lane to the Lord Palmerston. Premises built in 1861. The Huggins Brewery was the original. I'd never heard of Huggins before, but here we are. And then Watney Combe Reed, and it's now the Old Spot Brewing Company. That's a fairly recent picture, and that's a 1900 shot. But the interesting thing here about this pub is, of course, Ezekiel J. Bailey. But we're just looking, here we are with his license, but you can just see he's advertising for staff, excellent character, and asking for a middle-aged man. Now, that's not often you'd see that in a pub. But here we are. He writes to the vestry, the Camberwell vestry, saying, can you do something about the footway in front of my pub, please? Because the road, of course, would have been unmade. The road would have been mud, as would have the pavements. And he wanted the pavements to be flagged, stone, paving stones. But the vestry weren't very keen on spending money. But interestingly, there's this other quote a year later, which shows how bad things really were, in that the jury couldn't get to the pub because of the high state of the wind and the rotten and sloppy state of the footway and carriageways. Shows you the weather. Well, looking at the day of the wind, the weather was pretty bad then. And if it was a muddy road, given with horse buses and things going up and down it, not great. This is Ezekiel James Bailey's house, still here, just recently repainted. And he's turned down, they were often turned down to start with when they applied for a license, but usually got it again when they could show that there'd been sufficient houses built and let to justify. But the cop built the 2,500 that built the pub cost. This is his houses. This is one of his Derwent Grove, and this is a note in the paper about his contribution to East Dulwich. As if by magic, he's raised one of the most charming little estates in south of London, and tenants have been attracted great numbers. And Champion Hill Station, which of course is now East Dulwich, is now a busy centre, and East Dulwich is becoming the most popular important suburbs of the metropolis. I think he'd have been quite pleased to see East Dulwich now and see how vibrant it is. This is the typical sort of advertisements. This is when it's for sale in 1880. Bailey sold it earlier than that. He sold it 1876-77 because he needed money to buy land to carry on building. And this is describing it. Charles Hearn, Chas Hearn, was a real optimistic, if you could think of Trade Descriptions Act. I mean, you know, the house possesses every comfort one could desire, domestic arrangement in every way complete. Everything is fantastic. His adverts is it's, you know, increasing in value. And, you know, he points this out in every advertisement, where a few years ago there was nothing but immense fields. It's now thousands of houses. So he's saying, you know, it's going to be great. You come here. And the purchaser was Mr. Maisie. Just a sort of interesting aside, we know that Mr. Maisie was a cyclist or a tricycle owner because he had an accident and it was reported in newspapers. And here there was the great flood of Peckham when a sewer flooded the whole area. Peckham burst sewer on Peckham Rye. And we think that's what caused Maisie to move on, because he lost huge amounts of stock. And I suspect he wasn't insured. So everybody possessed much sympathy, but he needed, you know, he needed his stock back. But all his beer was spoilt. Here's the Huggins Brewery. These are to another advert. This is an 1890 advert of the landlord here. And this is just an illustration of things were quite brutal in those days. This poor girl, presumably a cook, she chose a couple of lead and small articles, value 5 shillings. Then she got 14 days hard labour. They weren't very nice to people who did it wrong. This is a shot in the 1980s. It just shows how much better East Dulwich is now, how it's come up in the world. You know, you look at this, it's badly maintained, badly painted, all veranda, nothing like it is now. So we're moving up Norcross Road to the Upland. Now, there's some dispute as to whether it's the Upland or the Uplands Tavern. Either way, it's now the Actress, of course. And it's owned by the Metropole Company, who also own the Foresters Arms, which we'll come to later, which is called the Bishops. And it has taken me ages to work out it is, of course, the Bishop and the Actress. Sayer was the first landlord. Shepherd we'll talk about, but it's been done up nicely. It looks good. But it's very popular. Billiards was huge business in late Victorian times. And the pubs, when they were promoting their billiard rooms and billiard tables, they used to call in professionals. And Peel and Mitchell were really top. Peel, in fact, was at the time world champion, because it was only the British who played it. And Mitchell were serious professionals, and they would get these professionals in and get a lot of the locals in to watch them. So it was a way of promoting your facilities. That's what you did. Here we are again. This is the Shepherds, Shepherd and Sons. Here's a couple of his adverts in 1901 and 1904. And this is quite a fascinating little article about when he went to renew his license. An Albert, and unfortunately it's behind my, so I can't see it, of Lancaster Gate, and visiting, and he decided to have tea at the Upland Tavern. And apparently Shepherd refused to serve him. It's just a sort of quaint, when you think how tea has come back, or coffee has come back into fashion in pubs. But this is quite interesting. Shepherd talks about, he paid £41,000 for the lease of the pub. That was a huge sum. a huge sum in those days, and he's got at least 64 years to run. And often the pubs would help with mortgages. The pub companies would help with mortgage, the breweries. Anyway, and here it's looking very sad in the 1980s and in the 2000s. But again, it's better than it was. So we just turn into Crystal Palace Road, or Rossmore Road as it was when this was built. Here's the castle. Built by George Norman. It's quite an interesting one, this. It didn't get a license for quite a long time, till the late 18s. It was built in the early 1870s, didn't get a license till the late 1870s, when Henry Jeffrey finally managed to do it. This is an advert with Joe Cap. Where's Joe Cap? Joe Cap here. And it showed you the kind of things that went on in the pub. The Royal Buffaloes, Royal Order of Ancient Buffaloes, the harmonic concerts. They served luncheons, large dining room, concert room. You know, it was really a social centre. But the most interesting thing about the castle is its political connotation. Certainly in the late 1880s, when Morgan Howard on the left and Sir Blundell Maple on the right, first he held, after the election, post-election parties, if you like. And if you can imagine Crystal Palace Road, the MPs, well, they were then elected, standing on the flat roof here in front of the pub, with 1,000 people round here cheering them along, singing "Hail the Conquering Hero Comes." And you know, he was surrounded by all the great and the good, and he was cheered by the crowds down below. A few things here of interesting things. How one of the was a pigeon. One of the wives of the landlord was a pigeon fancier, and she set up a pigeon fancying. The pigeon fancying was very big in Victorian times. You had the Loyal Ronson Lodge, which is the great Grand United Order of Oddfellows. Ronson actually had a factory in Lordship Lane where he made waterproofs. You know, they gave dinners, and it was a real, as I say, a real social. There's the proprietor Joe Cap giving his party, and his Christmas. The pub was known for its Christmas decorations, and a slate club where people paid a small sum of money in and collected it at Christmas. I mean, people do it today. I think this was sort of planted. This is an article, and I think it was planted where the paper says, "We need hardly say the first-rate cuisine prevails at the hostelry." And then I've added a bit about the slate club. And again, there's the castle in 1980 looking pretty sad. But the Crystal Palace Tavern, let's be optimistic, the Crystal Palace Tavern was built here on the site of the floorcloth factory because James Pullinger, owned the floorcloth factory and decided, no doubt, to diversify into housing and pubs. These floorcloths were made here out in the fields because they needed to dry in the open air. And it was a sort of type of early linoleum. It was sort of canvas fabric, which was painted with oil because, of course, Victorians, or poorer Victorians, East Dulwich couldn't afford carpets. So, yeah, quite what it would actually look like and how it would wear. But anyway, that's what he made. And all things, to start with, all things went really well. It was, this was a lot of what trap, bat and ball they played in the pubs. It was, he did very well to start with, and then he went bust. And I think probably because of he dabbled in housing and it didn't work. But this is the other sad thing about the pubs. This is just, they were often used as coroner's inquests. And here he is, the Camberwell coroner, about a poor little girl who's run over by a carriage, you know, a four-wheeled vehicle, a woodpacker of New Cross, where the driver tended to pull up, but the front wheel, yeah, not very pleasant. But that's you get quite a lot of, they were extensively used as coroners. This is Arthur Hine. Again, his career, pretty good career as he moves around. The Hine were a family, a large pub-owning family, and there's the famous case, which I won't go into here, on the Half Moon Hotel, of Casson versus Hine. where Casson sold the pub to Hine at an inflated price based on totally inflated income figures. But he soon moved out to Southend. But he was Arthur Hine. And this was the sort of thing, we're having a jolly, pub's jolly, out they go, from the Crystal Palace Tavern. Out to sea, mostly men, very few women. And here's an advertisement. Dawson and Blowers, they didn't last very long. They weren't very successful. Blowers had been a steward on a P&O ship out to Australia, where he met Dawson, and they came back and set themselves up, did a huge amount of advertising, and lasted less than a year. But here's a great picture again, thank you, Internet, of Herbert Cooper, manager, on the left, and Wilfred Brickell, barman, circa, I think, about 1918, when the proprietor was George Arthur Birtwell. So he employed Cooper to manage and Brickell to serve. And Cooper was manager and thing for quite a few years at the Crystal Palace Tavern. So let's go back to Lordship Lane and go to the Bishop. Now, the Bishop, interestingly, is different. It was built as a beer house and remained a beer house until relatively recently. Before it is a pub now, it is the Bishop. But a beer house could only, goes with the name, could only serve beer, and it couldn't serve, and occasionally they would serve wine, but they definitely couldn't serve spirits. But the pub you see today was built in 1877. There was an original one on the site, 1858, 59, but the one we see today is built 1877. And it's now, again, the Metropolitan Pub Co. and was originally the Forest Hill Brewing Company. There's lots of newspaper articles about assaults and damage, and here's one about willful damage. Damaged the plate glass door at the Foresters Arms, property of William Struggle, who was the landlord. He chucked the chap out, but then he smashed the window with his fist. But luckily, Police Constable 428P was nearby, and he accused him of did it. And yeah, here we go. He just, presumably he was drunk and just got a bit of, but he was fined 40 shillings. And here was another landlord was assaulted. Prisoner had entered by two mates. He'd already been told he didn't want him in the pub, and he refused to serve them. Using violent language and a terrible smash to his face, and caught him in the eye. As he staggered into the doorway, the prisoner made a running kick at him, but he avoided its full force. And then, as he was trying to recover, the poor landlord was punched behind the ear, and followed by, I mean, it sounded quite a fracas, but he obviously thought he was justified, but I think 2 months hard labour he got. This is a fire that Charles Cook had. Here's his advertisement, Charlie Cook's, Foresters Arms. And this was another one here, which is quite a common trick played on barmen particularly, was called ringing the changes. They would come in, buy a beer or something, and give the barman the money, and then say they'd given him a £5 note instead of a £1 note, that he'd given them the wrong change, although it was more 2 shillings and 6pence here. But yeah, this was quite a common trick, and they would work their way up the street, doing it at all the pubs, but they got caught on this one. And saying old, but this is on the Lloyd George Doomday service, which again you can get online. You can find the financial arrangements. This is 1910. So Charlie Cook's on a lease from 1899. He's paying £65, and he paid a premium of £700, which is actually pretty low, because certainly premiums were in the multi-thousands. As we saw with Shepherd's, it's 41,000. It was the Forest Hill Brewing Company was the owner. He was just the tenant. And there was another H.D. Burley, whoever he was, who was also the freeholder of the site. Here's a shot looking north up Lordship Lane. This was taken after 1906, because there's the big double-decker thing. So 1910, you can just see the corner of there's the name, the Foresters Arms. Yeah, noted house, all the rest of it. And all these streets are still there. Not the awnings, not so, but and now parked cars, of course. And again, slightly depressing view in the 1980s. The East Dulwich Tavern, or East Dulwich Hotel as it was when it started, built by James Swain Gurney, who had a very interesting career. Here it is, his name on the pub. This is a newspaper extract when Courage was the brewery. And he again, like Augustus Mann up at the Plough, which we talked about earlier, he took the Camberwell Vestry Court to get his rates reduced. Here he is applying for his license. They use barristers to apply for the license on their behalf. Mr. Straight here, Mr. Lillier Prose. The freeholder was the Bowyer Smith estate. Quite why they didn't want a pub on such an obvious corner is difficult to understand. But yeah, it cost £2,500 and it would improve the neighbourhood. And yeah, and they said, well, it's going to make your property better, Mr. Freeholder. But the license, they got the license. And here, luckily, again, on the internet, this is a calendar dated 1880. On the back of almost a sort of very, here it is, the East Dulwich Hotel. Courage and Co.'s porters. Just it's fascinating what you can find. And he even made his own stout, Gurney's Invalid Stout. Not sure I was convinced about that. And here he is. He'd been a bricklayer originally, and there's his sons, and here are his sons and his mother, his wife, Matilda. So that's James Gurney. He didn't press his trousers very well, but the sons were obviously a lot smarter. And there's his grandson, and there's his wife, Matilda. And she ended up in the licensed Victualler's Asylum in Asylum Road in Peckham. And a lot of them did. As they retired, there was nowhere to go, and that's where they went. And here's a picture taken, well, I think must be 1900, compared with today, and it's pretty much, although you had a horse trough in the middle of the road then rather than a roundabout, the view is pretty much the same. And a close-up, you've got this Imperial Stout, and a little note on this. I rather love this thing about specially made for the court of Catherine II of Russia, Barclays Perkins Imperial Stout. And this is a better shot of the horse box in the middle, horse trough, sorry, in the middle, and the horse drinking from it. And this was the pub, the ownership became Hoare & Co. in the 1930s, and this is a shot taken in the 1930s of what it looked like then. A couple of advertisements. This shows you how quickly the licensees could change. You've got D. Bear in February and White in June. Funnily enough, White, we got an inquiry from a relation. That's how we found out about him, that their great-grandmother had been born in the pub, but White was only there for a few months. And then you've got Cooksey. Well, Cooksey was a crook. And interesting, and I touched on the Casson versus Hine thing. Cooksey versus Cookson was another celebrated case done at the Plough further up the road, where Cooksey sold the pub to Cookson on the basis of rubbish figures, you know, the earnings. Nobody did their due diligence properly in those days, and you know, poor old Cookson paid Cooksey over £30,000, and if he'd done any due diligence, he would have worked out that Cooksey was a crook and had been in prison for all sorts of things, a real fraudster. But you hear here, you go to later, this is Frank Powell, and I love the way he puts in not Baden. Not, I think that unless he looked like Baden Powell, but I can't think anybody would mistake the publican at the East Dulwich Tavern for Lord and Baden Powell. But again, every article here of the highest quality, you know, all fantastic, can do receptions, club meetings, dinners, everything. Here's a couple of the interiors taken recently. They were big at Masons. Masonry was big at the East Dulwich Tavern. And it was quite, for the time, it's all cast iron frames holding up the building. It's quite an interesting pub. But finally, we come to the Cherry Tree. We come round into Grove Vale, the Cherry Tree, built as a beer house in 1859-60. Been through a series of names in its career. This is what it was like in 1900. It was rebuilt in the 30s. It's been through a whole list of names. And this is an interesting, landlords, if you were if you were a traveller, you could get a drink at pretty well any time. But if you were a local resident, you couldn't. You had to get your drink within the prescribed hours. So if you prove you were a traveller, you could get a drink. And if you were just local, you couldn't. Here's Charles Hearn selling the pub, talking about the houses built locally. Again, the arrangements, business, domestic, current, replete with every requisite. I'd like to know who these plans are prepared by this eminent architect for alterations, but who's... and here he is again, because this is in 1881, and he sold it again in 1892. He almost used the same copy. Yeah, fascinating stuff, and all available online. Here's a few adverts. There's a Mr. White, and here's Reuben Denman. But here is perhaps the most unfortunate event at the pub. We talked about Walter Collison up at the Magdala. Well, he moved down, or his family also acquired the Cherry Tree, and he moved down, and there's this case by his son, Stan, his 16-year-old son, accidentally shot a friend with an air gun, a model Winchester rifle. It was quite a furore at the time, a lot of articles in the papers, and in the end, Collison sold up and left. He couldn't stay. He continued as a public in a different part of the country, but he couldn't stay in East Dulwich. Very sad. But it's quite interesting. The jury says, how is it possible that this boy can just go in and buy the gun? But apparently in those days, you could just buy an air rifle in a shop. And they say to the police or to the prosecutor, they say, we recommend that this should be stopped. Americans perhaps should listen. This is the Cherry Tree, rebuilt in 1938. And that's one of its various other names, the Vale, in its career. But this is something I picked up. It was a celebration drink for the train robbers, as Ronnie Biggs used to drink there. Anyway, there we go, 45 minutes, and we come to the end, the slightly depressing end. That's still the Grove Tavern. I haven't included that in the talk because we gave a talk on that before now, but hopefully things are moving on, but looking at that, they certainly need to. Anyway, that's the end.